Why do we need to study the history and ideas that lasted from the Western tradition? It's because it's not because they're Western. It's because these ideas shaped our world. These ideas actually made the societies that we must learn to navigate in, and that made the societies that, frankly, are as, life isn't perfect, but these are open societies that have achieved a level of tolerance for multi-ethnic populations that really doesn't exist anywhere else. And we should,
people forget there's not a heterogeneous society elsewhere, right? That has all these different populations.
Something like this has never happened before. And all things considered, we do actually coexist rather well.
You're not supposed to say that, I think. I'm Joe Lonsdale. Welcome to the American Optimist. Thomas, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So you're named after an English poet, I understand. Is that right?
That's right.
Tell us about your upbringing. Where's that from?
So I'm named after a kind of proto-romantic 18th century poet from Bristol, Thomas Chatterton, who he's kind of the picture image of neglected genius. He was a fatherless boy and grew up in poverty, and actually started writing poems that he passed off as earlier kind of versions of poetry that he'd found. And so
he's pretending he found it in order to. Why was he doing that?
He was a prankster. Banksy's also from Bristol. I don't know. He's kind of in the prankster tradition.
Same energy.
He was like an 11-year-old boy and saying he found these medieval poems in the church across the street from his house. And at some point, people realized that they were fakes, and so they accused him of being a plagiarist and just passing off
Wow.
crap. But in fact, he was writing them himself, and he had an extraordinary kind of talent. And he also was able to write poems in his own voice at some point. And so all of this, he was recognized after he died, penniless in London.
Wow.
And so my father my father was a fatherless boy growing up in Galveston, Texas. And at some point when he heard the story of Thomas Chatterton, it really resonated with him. In some ways it's beautiful because he identified with this person from a different time and certainly a different race, but they had experiences that my father thought were really somewhat similar. And I think my father found in his own life that he had not been able to achieve some of the things that he had wanted to achieve. So the kind of idea was that you're going to wear this kid's name, and you're going to, in some ways, you're going to do honor to him.
And so your dad always wanted you to be a writer, I read that you said.
Yeah, he did. And so that kind of, and at some point I realized, this kid died when he was 17, and I hope to make it past that, but in some ways, wearing the name, nomen et omen or whatever, wearing the name of a writer kind of gave me the confidence that, that was something that, I could do, and it wasn't a strange thing to do. And so I think that was a real gift that my dad gave me. At some point after I started writing for the New York Times, the Thomas Chatterton Society in Bristol reached out to me and asked me to come and speak to them about Thomas Chatterton.
Oh, cool.
Which was strange. They, because the woman was just Googling Thomas Chatterton and came across some of my writing. And so I went out a couple of times and spoke to the society, and, there were Thomas Chatterton scholars that were much more interested in him than even my father and I had ever been. And it came out that, in fact, he didn't die of despair in London, penniless, but in fact his career, they were arguing his career was taking off, and that he was actually really successful with women, and he had a little bit too much success, and so he was trying a remedy for syphilis, and he didn't poison himself, but he had died by accident, because there's this gorgeous painting by Henry Wallace called The Death of Chatterton that hangs in the Tate Museum. That's like this poet drinking his arsenic in despair.
Oh, no.
But in fact, it was a mark of his success. So
that's funny. That was a disease that came from the New World, I understand. It was prevalent then. And so your first book was called Losing My Cool: How a Father's Love and 15,000 Books Beat Hip-Hop Culture. Talk a little bit about that. How it was you felt hip hop culture was obviously very in opposition to this way your father was raising you and your love of literature.
This is one of those things where, subtitles get you into some trouble, and it's very difficult to sum up the thrust of a book in one subtitle. But what I was really talking about is the kind of street culture. I grew up in the 80s and mostly the 90s, and the kind of street culture that was sold to Black youth as a kind of racial authenticity, oftentimes through mainstream commercialized hip hop music and culture. So it's not that.
So there's a certain culture you had. The signal is you have to be part of this in order to be authentic. And
you have to kind of affect a kind of street credibility, and that was very tied up with your sense of yourself as being authentic to your race. And
so you weren't really being Black if you weren't doing certain things.
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that it's very it's a controversial thing to say, and even Barack Obama got a lot of pushback when he said it. But
I definitely shouldn't say it. Then let's let you tell me about it.
Well, there was absolutely the sense that certain behaviors were considered acting white, and that there was an oppositional kind of identity that was built up against that.
Where do you think that came from? Why did that have to be that way?
Well, it didn't have to be that way, and part of what my book is doing is really juxtaposing my American experience with my father's, growing up in the 30s and 40s in the segregated South, and having a very different Black experience, but not having the experience of attempting to emulate the guys in the street. That was actually not considered racially authentic or what you need to do. And the sense of an oppositional identity, that's more of a post-civil rights and hip hop era adaptation that happened to the culture. And that was so my book is in many ways, I'm trying to explore why my generation was in some ways sabotaging ourselves, even as some of the external obstacles that my father's generation faced had been removed.
What, is this still happening a lot today? Is it getting better? Where are we going?
I think in a lot of ways things have gotten better. I think certainly the kind of cartoonish stereotype that was very successful, the gangster stereotype that was successful in the 90s and early 2000s, that has gotten a lot more complicated, and hip hop has evolved, and depictions of Black masculinity and what's considered authentic have certainly.
It seems like there's more stuff about making money in it now than there was 20 or 30 years ago. Is that or not?
No,
really?
I mean, in the 90s, Jay-Z and Puff Daddy were.
Similar to that,
they were making money, and they were kind of exemplifying that. Which isn't even the worst. I mean, the kind of work ethic that a guy like Jay-Z embodied, that's not necessarily the worst thing to try to emulate. But, the idea that first and foremost, you identify yourself through physical attributes as opposed to mental endeavors. I think that's very harmful.
Yeah.
And also, the notion that you want to buck the system instead of learning how to operate within the system.
Does this stuff just move based on this cultural force that's really hard for anyone to affect, or are there certain ways that allies or people inside the culture could steer it in a more positive way? How does this get better?
Well, in some ways it has gotten better, and I think so part of what I was arguing in that book is that symbols really matter, ideas matter, images matter, what you see as possible in the world matters, and I think that it didn't change all of the problems that we have in society, obviously, but the image and the example of Barack Obama, I do think transformed. I don't think it's too much to say that it transformed to an extent Blackness in America and made and normalized certain ideas and destigmatized other ideas in a way that was very liberating and freeing. Also, hip hop culture got a lot more successful, and you got a lot more examples of different ways of being in the culture. And so this kind of narrow stereotype wasn't the only way.
There's a lot of people around me who've been very successful who want to use their success to try to help and be a positive force for this is going. And like you said, it's a very dangerous thing because you're not even supposed to talk about some of these issues, let alone they try to help. One of the ideas is just, maybe we can bring talent from some of these communities and help them build companies. I've built a lot of big companies. Maybe can they be part of these new big companies we're building? And then that could change. If they make a lot of money doing that, would that be a good role model? What are the types of things we should be thinking about doing to try to be helpful?
Well, I think that, everything comes back to the kind of education you're exposed to early on and the kind of cultural capital that you're able to access. And by the time you're talking about high school or college, you're already very late. So I think that, everybody having an access to a kind of quality daycare and early education would be enormously transformative.
So fixing early education.
I think that's fundamental.
School choice is one part of this for you, or you think about, or.
Yeah, I actually do. I mean, I'm not a scholar of this specifically, but I think that, I live in Paris, and one of the things that I've really become aware of, especially during COVID, is the extent to which we rely on high quality public options for our young son who's got high quality daycare.
Mm-hmm. How old is your young son?
He's 3.
Awesome.
And, there are a lot of families that are, not only do the parents not have the kind of cultural capital that will allow them to flourish in the American economy, but they don't really have much hope of getting their kids into that because they don't even have the ability to go to work and put food on the table knowing that their kids are well looked after. So that some of the problems are so fundamental and basic that I think that actually access to daycare, even before you talk about the kind of education you're getting in K through 12,
so daycare
is
and quality
extraordinarily
education.
important.
So the early education. Now, that's very interesting. Thomas, you're currently working on a book about illiberalism. I'm curious, what to start with liberalism. What does liberalism itself mean? How do you see liberalism, and why is it important?
Well, I think that, when I'm talking about a liberal society or the liberal values, I'm talking about openness, maximal tolerance for opposing and different and diverse views.
Something we don't have very much.
Something
right
we
now.
don't really have very much right now. You're talking about compromise and persuasion and, institutions working as opposed to kind of permanent opposition.
Yep.
or getting changes and laws through by sheer force or by fiat. I think, we're in a crisis where we don't trust our institutions as legitimate. Fully half of the country, I think in 2024, either way the election pans out, will feel that the election was illegitimate, and that's
both sides now are saying things are illegitimate if they don't get it done their way.
Yeah,
it's intense.
It's really dangerous. And so my book is actually it's probably evolved a little bit since the language on the AEI website, which I have to update. I'm working on a book that's trying to trace the ideas and events leading up to this kind of hinge moment of 2020.
So what happened basically in the last 20, 30, 40 years that led to this problem?
Yeah, and that led to this moment where I think that 2020, the confluence of the pandemic, the racial reckoning after George Floyd, and then the specter of Trump, and the idea that American democracy itself was potentially going to end, that this was the most important election in history, and that the entire country, was at stake. I think that this opened up a kind of state of exception, and people were very vulnerable, and it's transformed our media, cultural, academic.
When you feel like it's a state of exception, you drop your values in order to get something done, and it makes
absolutely. I mean, you had people on the left certainly willing to compromise values that values of free speech, for example.
Stop free speech or be willing to lie to stop something they thought's worth
this
stopping.
Is an emergency, but you have to be very careful. You really want to give up free speech that easily?
Yeah.
That's a very dangerous path to go down.
When we're talking about what led to this, one of the things that I think is really important is in the 1980s, Stanford dropped teaching the history of Western civilization. A lot of other schools did too, right? Jesse Jackson came in at Stanford, right?
I think they didn't actually drop it. Yeah, there was a protest about it, about this Western Civ class, but
they changed the core, right? They changed the core, so you no longer learn about the classics. You no longer learn there's I'm not the West is the best by far. Or there's value in every culture around the world. I believe that, but I do think the West was unique in its ability to have liberalism, succeed and then kind of spread those values around the world.
So I think we've lost that history.
Yeah, and I think we've lost that. You wrote about how your father encountered Plato and it changed his life. It seems tied to a similar thing. Is that a big part of what led to these problems that we've given some of this stuff up?
Well, I mean, we have a crisis of education, certainly, and there's a kind of lack of. I think there's a kind of. It's difficult to get people to just flat out defend great books courses, or or dead white men, even though it'd be surprising to Socrates and Plato that they were white guys, because they didn't necessarily have much in common with the guys down the street who were outside of Athens city limits. But there's this idea that that we need to.
I love how I'm Irish on one side and Jewish on the other side, but I'm just like a white guy. That's
but isn't that strange? Because
it's weird,
actually those are extremely different identities.
Yeah, and both were minorities that were beat the shit out of in different cases, by the way.
Right.
But now I'm like, it's just funny, and then they merge together, and now I'm the majority or something. Yeah.
Absolutely, the idea of monolithic whiteness is relatively recent, and it smooths over so many important ethnic trajectories into kind of one thing. But to talk about why do we need to study the history and ideas that lasted from the Western tradition, is because it's not because they're Western, it's because these ideas shaped our world. These ideas actually made the societies that we must learn to navigate in, and that made the societies that frankly are as, life isn't perfect, but these are open societies that have achieved a level of tolerance for multi-ethnic populations that really doesn't exist anywhere else. And we should,
people forget there's not a heterogeneous society elsewhere, right? That has all these different populations.
Something like this has never happened before. And all things considered, we do actually coexist rather well.
You're not supposed to say that, I think.
But I think when you have to, because it's all crisis mode all the time, and technology and social media amps this up all the time. You could go onto Twitter and think that things have never been worse.
No,
but things actually have really, and I'm constantly writing, with an eye to understanding the kind of country that my dad grew up in. And, you have to be crazy to not, you don't get complacent, but this is a different country. And and I'm really lucky to be in this country, or to be in a society like contemporary France. And I think that we really lose perspective on what has been achieved.
No, my grandma was born in 1920, came here when she was 1 from the Jewish side. Most of her relatives were killed, of course, she's from Poland, so killed back in the Holocaust. And but she talks about when she was young, there's like the Jewish part of town and the Irish part of town, and there's like really tough race relations, and people, there's just all sorts of crazy stories. Everyone thought of things purely in terms of race, and it feels like people want to go back to that though in a little bit, which is really scary to me.
It is scary actually, because the goal was to transcend those differences.
And I thought we kind of had in the 80s. I guess I was naive. I was growing up in a very multicultural place in the Bay Area, and you didn't really think of things as much in terms of race. But now it feels like you're pushing kids to do that again.
And what's strange is that actually you have the racists, but then you have the new anti-racists who share a lot of the same premises and presuppositions as the racists do, that the category is everything. It's the thing that's most important about the individual. It's the thing that can never be fully transcended. That's extraordinarily counterproductive from my perspective.
Yeah, I've gotten in trouble for saying I disagree with Kendi, but I do disagree that you can't actually talk about cultures and analyze things. He says, I guess to me the anti-racism is to just turn your brain off as well. I don't know, that's my impression of what he's saying, is you're not allowed to criticize anything.
Well, he has this argument that is pure cultural relativism, that you can't say that no culture is better or worse than any other culture, but that's clearly overly simplified, because depending on what you want to achieve, some cultures do pursue certain goals that other cultures are even indifferent towards pursuing.
Or some cultures treat women really badly and don't let them out of the house, or don't let them own money. And I think we all agree to criticize those. But
if you value feminine autonomy and equality, then you would say that some cultures achieve that better than others.
That's ironic to me, because the left usually is very aware of those issues, and yet probably would criticize those cultures. But then you come over here and it's like, you got to turn your brain off. You can't talk about any of the issues.
Oh yeah. There's a lot of places where you have to leave your sense of contradiction at the door.
So Thomas, you drafted the Harper's Letter in 2020, right? This is very
prominent. And 4 other writers drafted and organized the signatures.
So you were calling out the rise of left-wing illiberalism, and
right wing. I mean, we were calling out both. We were saying that for the record, Donald Trump is an illiberal, censorious force in our nation's politics and culture. But also, there's a rising illiberalism in progressive institutions.
And what's your view a year and a half later? Is this?
It's gotten worse. In some ways, it's gotten better because there's awareness, but
It does feel like people are aware the woke stuff is a little bit crazy now.
yeah, and a lot of people have suffered, and a lot of people are aware that they don't feel good in there. They don't feel secure. Very few writers would tell you that they feel just totally secure in this game.
I feel like the far left started coming for the mainstream left, and that's when everyone started to realize, wait a second. Right?
Yeah, because your closest, they never actually come for the alt-right or for actual white supremacists. They come for the person that's basically agreeing with them on every issue, but differs just slightly.
I feel like if you're a good person who basically agrees with them, that you're the one who's most in danger for stepping out of line on something.
Exactly. And and because the purpose is not to cancel as many people as engage in wrongthink, but to make some examples, because the onlooker effect is so powerful. So that's why, like, Barry Weiss, who basically agrees with liberals on 9 out of 10 positions, has to be made an example of
For her wrongthink on this other
for her
one.
wrongthink on the very small amount of issues that she disagrees on.
No, that makes sense. And it's interesting. You, in our popular piece you wrote last year, you actually did attack the right. You didn't like the fact they were restricting critical race theory teaching in schools, which was interesting to me. I'm curious to hear.
I think banning is not the way to achieve the society that we want to achieve.
But so it's an interesting question, because I believe in free speech, but I also believe like the government shouldn't be teaching certain things in a wrong way. Like if the government was teaching like about how like the view of Nazis or something, like we'd probably be like, oh, maybe we shouldn't teach the view of like the Nazis thought, too much, at least. That'd be kind of weird, right? So
well, yeah, but we do teach the views of Nazis in certain history courses, because you need to know. I think that the answer is always more knowledge and beating bad ideas with better
Should
ideas.
they make sure that if they're teaching critical race theory, they're also teaching what smart people think who disagree with it then? Or would that be like
Or I think that on the level of free expression, that parents should get involved in their schools and make compelling cases about, what's wrong with the curriculum and convince teachers what's flawed in critical race theory. But the idea that there's a ban, that opens up a can of worms that I think people don't fully understand, that once you get in the business of banning certain ideas on the basis of, because some of these laws are written in such a way that anything that makes someone feel uncomfortable, something so vague, first of all, it can't really stand up in court, but if it could, you're not always going to be in power, and things that you think of as uncomfortable will not always be the ideas that are targeted. So you open up a kind of way of regulating thought that I think is very counterproductive.
So banning is really, really tough. It is interesting if you did have if you had like a crazy wing of the KKK or whatever that like somehow infiltrated and convinced like 80% of people in like some schools to teach something, you'd probably want to stop them from teaching a philosophy you disagreed with. But so it's interesting to me. Like, so I think a lot of people see CRT as this like neo-Marxist philosophy that's like brainwashed a bunch of people, and so they're really afraid. Don't try to brainwash our kids with this. So what should they be doing?
But see, the thing is that
instead?
Also when you ban it, you don't actually get the true believers don't stop.
They don't stop because you're not arguing against.
Because
them.
they're not actually teaching specific CRT texts. It's a methodology. It's a way of seeing the world. It's a way of
so you can't really
teaching.
You can't ban their way of seeing the world anyway.
You can't.
So
you have to persuade.
So you got to argue and persuade. Should they be requiring certain things to be taught? Perhaps would that be like if they were going to do something? Would that be better? Like require something small?
I'm always in favor of adding more.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if that's not an accurate picture of the history of the United States, make a fuller, more accurate picture. But the idea that you can eliminate discomfort from the study of history, you can't do that in any nation on earth, because history is riddled with things that to our contemporary sensibilities are uncomfortable.
Even stuff going on today.
Even stuff going on today, if you're talking about the world accurately.
We're not supposed to talk about North Korea and China and everywhere else. And in parts of Africa, we just don't talk about some of the nasty stuff going on. And I
mean, there's, for example, like you can't, this is considered something unwelcome in any debate, but there is slavery right now in Ghana, now in Africa. We're talking about, we talk, and of course, things that happen at home are going to matter more than things that happen halfway around the world for most people. But there is something rich about the fact that we can't stop talking about the 17th century in America. But right now, no one's talking about the hundreds of thousands. I mean, we had video on smartphones of open slave markets in Libya a few years ago. Slave markets when Gaddafi fell.
It's crazy. We are. It does seem like it's getting better, I guess, in those parts of the world. We were involved a lot when I was at Palantir company started 18 years ago, like looking into supply chains and figuring out where slavery was and helping disrupt it. It was amazing. We found slavery in Southeast Asia and places.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
You know, and obviously all sorts of these areas. So I do think
you were helping to disrupt those.
Yeah,
networks?
so we'd just go to companies and be like, you should like look into your full supply chain and like find these things, and we'd help them do it and disrupt it and call it. When you call these things out, you know, and make them, you know, companies get embarrassed, and then it sticks to the problem, because then the slavery becomes unprofitable if people aren't willing to have it in their supply chain, which kind of messed up that you have to use profit to stop slavery. But I mean, it's like
human nature, right?
Yeah, yes, that's the way. I mean, yeah, there's probably other ways you should be able to stop it. But no, so we've been involved in these issues. It does seem like it's getting better, but it's crazy, right? It's still around. I think it's something that people are really bad at, is the moral relativism of like, hey, this is a problem, but this is an even bigger problem, and everyone says you can't criticize that because we're not perfect, therefore we can't say anything about anyone else, which seems like a tough argument.
Yeah, I think it's a standard that's unrealistic. But you know, like, am I pronouncing his name Chamath correctly? Chamath. I mean, what he said was a really people aren't usually that blunt.
I think he was being honest about the views. I know a lot of MBA owners, and I think he's being honest. It's not one of their top 20 or 30 priorities.
But they'll pretend, and they'll say what.
They'll sort of say, oh yeah, it's a shame, but then do nothing.
Right.
Where he's like, you know what? They don't actually care. I mean, and you think about it, like, they actually don't care about the slavery in Ghana, and they're not doing it either.
They definitely
should. They're not, right?
It's
like there's like maybe the league with all black people should care about the fact there's black slaves, or maybe they should be caring about the fact that North Korea has been a slave state forever, and we never say anything or do anything. And so yeah, I think he was being honest in a way that was very uncomfortable.
I think that people, I mean, I don't remember the last time I saw a public figure speak that candidly.
Yeah.
In a way that cuts against the.
He's a very, very smart guy. I disagree with him on that. I think we should all be fixing these issues, but I like the fact that he was totally honest about it, how they see it. I want to ask about your Race in America, about your book in 2019. You wrote a book, The Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race. And what do you mean by unlearning race? And is race a social construct? Like, how should we be thinking of race right now?
Yeah, well, it is a social construct. It's not biologically meaningful. There's nothing about a group that can tell you anything about an individual.
Got it.
Right?
Because individuals could be anywhere on the spectrum. So a group could have a different average, but it's not meaningful for an individual.
Groups can have different averages for a variety of reasons, you know, and none of that, in the standard understanding of race, none of that amounts to racial differences within the species Homo sapiens. You know, we geneticists will call it population pools or whatever. Yep. And I'm willing to say that, you know, if the science changes and people show that population pools actually are mean something other than what the state of knowledge says they mean right now, I'd be willing to adapt my view on that. But it still would never. And I'm not aware of anybody who seriously argues that it would be able to tell you
about the person,
about the individual.
Yeah, every person.
And that's getting back to your question about liberalism. Yeah. Liberalism is about treating people as individuals, not as avatars of identity groups. And so, what's happening now with the kind of, you know, the fetishization of racial difference. And let's, for the sake of argument, let's say it's not biologically meaningful, which most scientists do say. We act as though it is. So we have this cognitive dissonance. We say that there's not this division between humans, and then we go and recreate it every single day, and it drives us mad. And you know, racism creates race. You know, you look for justifications for why you treat people differently.
So this is kind of like an anti-collectivist sort of philosophy.
I mean, I think you have to be. First and foremost, you have to protect the dignity of the individual, and you know, the way that we do race, the way that we came up with abstract color categories that group people along a scale of hierarchy. This was handed down to us from the slave trade. This is the product of the collision of Europe and Africa and the New World through slavery. These are terms and ways of thinking of ourselves and each other that are irredeemably linked to that. So I get frustrated with the anti-racist discourse that just says that, no, people still have these fundamental racial differences.
So that they're playing in the paradigm of slavery, basically, is what you're saying.
But you can't be, you have to be against the racial oppression as it still exists. But you can't stop there. You actually have to look beyond that and want to shift the paradigm, or you're going to keep recreating.
So given that problematic paradigm, what do you think of all the far left obsession with like CRT and equity and disparate impact?
I think it exacerbates the problem.
Should we be measuring?
Says it wants to counteract.
Should we be measuring disparate impact at all? Is that like a dumb idea for the most part, or how?
No,
how do we
I think
about
that there are ways to do it that don't reify race. So you can talk about, so in France they don't, for example, and this is not a perfect society, but they don't measure race. So they don't actually, everyone's just a French citizen.
Yep.
So you can't actually do affirmative action based on race in France because no one knows. But they can do it, like sometimes they can help people from certain zip codes, because actually it's not that being biologically descended from people from Morocco makes you necessarily in need of a hand up in France. There are actually quite wealthy Moroccans in France. Yeah. But being from certain zip codes, if you want to help...
So do it based on poor areas, maybe.
And you'll actually end up helping a lot of Moroccan kids,
if that's your goal. So you think that'd be like a better way to do it here, too? Don't think about the race.
I do, because...
Is parental income then maybe something, too?
Life is a lot more complicated than, and also, you reinforce notions of inferiority when you say that essentially belonging to a group is essentially a handicap.
How do we make that shift? It seems like there's all this philosophy, all this investment of all these companies around this racial identity stuff.
Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight, but I think coming back to what we were talking about before, I think you have to make that shift by persuading people because most people want to be doing good. I think a lot of people, this is good faith stuff. Most people don't understand the ways in which the ideas of permanent racism, permanent white supremacy that CRT revolves around, how that's counterproductive to the goals that you do genuinely want to achieve, which is that everybody attains a kind of equality, at least an equality of opportunity.
Yeah.
And this is actually counterproductive. So I think we have to persuade people and show people why Kendeism doesn't get you to where you say you want to go.
It seems like a lot of people might even know that it doesn't, but it's like a way to express their anger, or a way to express their frustration?
I've spent so much time thinking about this and trying to understand why. And, I don't know. I think that a lot of people also, life is full, people are busy, they want to do good, but
they grab on to what they're told is the thing.
Yeah, and they don't have a ton of time to sit with all of the issues. You got to put food on the table, you got to do your job, you're tired. Kendi says any discrepancy in groups is evidence of either one group being superior or inferior or racism. Yeah. So I don't believe black people are inferior. So I see that these kids are not graduating in the same, so it must be racism. And I got other stuff I got to do. So, Yeah,
it's just they're just going fast and they want to be a good person.
I think so. And so I think that actually that's how you get a lot of bad ideas succeeding.
So you're an American, but you've lived in France for how long? Have you been in France for?
It's been 10 years now.
Been 10 years. Has that changed your view on the U.S. and its role in the world at all? How do you see the U.S. differently?
Yeah, I mean, I missed some exciting years in the U.S. I come back and forth a lot, but I think that the sad thing to say from Europe, and I spent a bit of time in Germany too. America's lost some shine from the overseas point of view, and it's a less reliable partner, and the world seems dangerous, and there might be a war very close to a lot of our Western European neighbors, and they don't know. If you look what happened in Afghanistan this summer, they don't always know who's going to keep the world safe for them from their perspective. They don't know that half the country will accept the person who's elected as a legitimate leader. Yeah. And they don't know if the next president will reverse all of the things that they thought they could trust from the previous president.
How do we fix this with Europe? I mean, it's not going to be a fast thing, but what do we have to do?
I think we have to get our own house in order. I think you can't really be a good ally so long as your own house is constantly burning. And we have a crisis here, man. I mean, and it goes way beyond partisan politics. We have a crisis of legitimacy. So many Americans don't believe that the political system is legitimate, not even is reflecting their goals, but is legitimate. Yeah, I think that the possibility for violence is not zero. Is crazy, and that was not how it felt when I left America in 2011. That's like the before times. People voted Republican or voted Democrat. Barack Obama was not everybody's choice for president, but
He was respected, though. Yeah.
He was a legitimate president.
Yeah.
Even George Bush,
Yeah.
even after the way that things shook out in Florida, Al Gore conceded and Americans accepted that he was the legitimate president. And we're in a different ballgame now.
So the show's called American Optimists. We're trying to look for reasons to be positive. And I am very positive. I'm a builder of companies. There's a lot of really cool new technology that just lifting up a lot of lives, curing diseases, helping people.
That's a fact.
Yeah. Focus on building things. You're a writer, cultural critic. I'm curious from your perspective, what should those builders be focused on? If you could like wave a wand and like have all the people building things, do something to make things better, what would you do?
I mean, what I'm going to say to you is going to sound really modest because you're thinking of going to space and you're thinking of doing like really crazy difficult things. But if you genuinely care about things like the debates we're having around CRT or how do we make a multi-ethnic society work, or how do we improve outcomes for kids, I think investing in new institutions, which probably actually is a lot less expensive than some entrepreneurs and philanthropists imagine.
What kind of institutions?
So I think that we have a problem when the media becomes essentially ideologically driven, and we need more genuinely independent, publications, whether digital, but also, print matters to a lot of people. Taking everything digital isn't, I don't think, always the answer, but we need new systems of bestowing prestige. So, what happens when the MacArthur Foundation gets completely ideologically captured by one point of view? Why aren't there other sources of validation and prestige and prizes? And these are things that could actually make an ecosystem of knowledge production more heterodox.
No, I agree. We're trying with the University of Austin with Barry Weiss.
That's right. Yeah. And so I was actually talking about this yesterday. There's so much wealth in this country. It's actually kind of amazing that this is the first time someone in a while since Stanford or Duke or something that somebody ambitiously is trying to start a new.
Well, everyone's rooting against us, though. Is the problem. It's
so
like
you have to succeed.
People
you
don't
actually have to make a really quality.
And it's hard because I think this would be a total failure if it went to the right, and it would also be a failure if it was conquered by the same people who conquered all the other universities. So it has to not be conquered by anyone.
Right.
And it's just really, really hard because everyone instantly assumes that it's being conquered already, even though you include people from both sides. And so it's like this mind virus of being on the left or the right, like tacks and pulls at everything. And I honestly find myself too, when I'm doing my very best to be moderate, like sometimes you get one part of your brain that's like, oh, screw that guy, he goes against my view on this, and it's really hard. Like
that's why people think it's easy. It's actually, people think that being a moderate just means that like whatever people on the left or right think, you just like are wishy-washy. But it's actually like very hard. You actually have to believe in compromise, believe in not getting all of what you want. You believe in actually making alliances with people that share some of your goals.
So how should writers and journalists and artists be approaching this? Like, what should they be doing to help with this?
I think that what you have to be doing is be willing to say what you genuinely believe and pay the cost of not being the most popular person on Twitter.
Courage, you're saying.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually very difficult because these are, there's an overproduction of elites, there's labor scarcity, people want to be liked, people want to go along to get along. And I think that, artists and writers have an obligation to be true to what they genuinely believe. And you would be shocked, or maybe you wouldn't be shocked, but a lot of people would be shocked by what people believe privately compared to what their public positions actually end up being.
There's more courage up there. So we started American Optimists to try to push back on this wave of cynicism. Maybe last question, like what's the best case to be optimistic about liberalism in America?
It's the only system that really works. It's the system that's gotten us the kind of quality of life that we kind of take for granted to the point that we're experimenting with forms that have never worked in the past and won't work in the future. Liberalism makes possible your ability to dissent, your ability to protest, your ability to critique.
And you think enough people hopefully will realize this, that we're gonna see it win again?
I hope it doesn't have to get too bad for people to miss what they had.
Awesome, Thomas. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.